Welcome, everyone, to this panel today that I'm super excited about. It's incredibly timely and a perfect conversation, I think, for South by Southwest on do pods in public schools have to be at odds? We have an all-star lineup of folks who can address this question from multiple angles. We have New Jersey State Senator Teresa Ruiz. We have Mia Pritz from Wonder School and Jeremiah Cota, the head of the San Carlos Micro School in Arizona. And the big question that I'd love to start with all of you, and thank you so much for being here, is how do we define micro schools and pods and think about it in the current moment? And I'd love you to talk about how your organization or you as an individual come to this question and topic of micro schools and pods and how you support them.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here this morning. Wonder School helps support early learning programs and micro schools and pods. And to me and to Wonder School, a pod and a micro school can mean the same thing. It can mean something different. But in general, it usually means a small group of children who come together regularly to learn. It is often a mixed age group of children, but not always. And if you think about a micro school, I tend to think more of a permanent schooling solution for a family or a child where they're enrolled in that micro school. They spend their full-time learning hours there. And a pod is something that seems like more of a temporary situation due to COVID, although I use the word temporary very loosely in this case. And like Michael, I have experience with a pod myself. I have a first grader, and so I hired a teacher and brought her into our community and had a small pod of first graders for August through December of 2020. And we support pods, micro schools, and family childcare programs. Family childcare programs are inherently pods or micro schools because they're small groups of children already, but we help the owners start their businesses and operate them, and then we help parents find those care options so that they can get the support they need for whatever their child's learning needs are.
Terrific. It's super helpful as an encapsulation. Jeremiah, why don't you jump in next, and then Teresa will go to you.
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and thank you for having me this morning. My name is Jeremiah Cota. I'm with the San Carlos Micro School. I'm the site founder of our micro school, and we are basically a small school located on the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation. We started back in 2018 of January, and we started because we had some parents and we had some families who wanted different options in their local community, and being from a tribal community, our options for schooling educational opportunities are super limited. So that was 2018, and we found a church and we used one of their empty classrooms throughout the week, and we started off with 6 kids in a classroom. And that has grown to about 17 in the past 2 years. But basically, as Mia was saying, a micro school is essentially, I would agree with you that a micro school is more of a permanent site. We do have a permanent location where kids are coming to the site throughout the entire day. They are learning there, Monday through Thursday. We don't do Fridays, but they are coming there Monday through Thursday. It's a permanent location, and we are essentially a return to the one-room schoolhouse. We have kids from kindergarten all the way up to about 10th grade right now, all in one room, which is amazing to think about, but that is allowed because of technology that we have. So students are learning basically at their level, individualized learning plans due to technology. We have students learning on Khan Academy. We have students learning on English language recorder. And so basically these students are basically learning at their individualized learning plans. They are able to do this all in one room, and that's exactly what we like to do. So my experience is basically starting a micro school, operating it on a day-to-day basis. I don't actually teach the class. I have someone else teach the class, but I do the operations, I do the administration, and so far we've been successful throughout the pandemic. This is something that we were already doing. So the pandemic, switching to virtual, switching to online, learning from home, that was kind of an easy thing for us to do. Thankfully, that was something we were easily able to adapt to. But I believe our solution does work, and I believe, it is working for our families. And as we've seen throughout the pandemic, it's actually very easily able to adapt and respond to whatever parents are needing in a quick time. So that is what our micro school is doing.
Terrific. Super helpful to frame how you've come into this. And Senator Ruiz, you've come at this from a different angle, obviously, getting into this because of COVID in many ways. Can you talk about your experience with these pods and micro schools and how you think about them in the communities in which you work?
So I'm just learning the title and the term micro schools actually from the cohort that's here on this panel. I came into the conversation of pods because I was beginning to see articles come up in the tri-state area that families who had resources, who had space, who were able to stay at home, were creating these new networks of learning environments for their blocks or for their families or the pool of people they were bringing it in. And for me, it became an equity issue because, again, the families that I represent don't necessarily have the space, may not understand the language that their children are learning in. It certainly didn't have the extra resources to create kind of these environments. So in a time where COVID had increasingly lifted the conversation about equity and opportunity and how our Black and Brown communities continue to get compounded, I drafted a piece of legislation that was requiring the Department of Education to establish a learning pod program that would just offer a safe space for all children to learn virtually. And what did that mean? Just thinking outside of the box, maybe creating contracts with the local Y or the Boys and Girls Club or a nonprofit center so that the mom and dad who cannot stay home and just, turn on the computer or even have access to computer could safely drop their child off at a learning center the same way these pods were working for families who had resources. So from my angle, it came from an equity perspective, trying to artificially recreate it and provide for it in a public space where my families don't necessarily have those resources. It was introduced, the bill really hasn't moved, but I think it gives an opportunity, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, that I think learning pods can really lend itself to a new form of teaching and learning for the future that can help fill the void for bridging the achievement gap in many states.
Senator, I'd actually love to pick up right there as we start to dig into this moment. There was a lot of media attention, a lot of mostly con voices, I would argue, in the media because of the equity concerns that are very real around this phenomenon. But there are a lot of pros around pods that you just alluded to as well. I'd love to dig into your perspective first on those pros and cons around pods and micro schools, and then me and Jeremiah will come to you with the same framing.
So I think the pros and cons, we can really shape in the same way our public school systems are set up, right? So I have public school systems in different settings that have more resources. And let's be honest in this conversation that pods, regardless as to how we're framing them, exist all the time on a daily basis for a family who has resources. After school tutorial programs, summer academy camps, taking your child to a museum. That's an extended pod and an extended version of a learning environment in the household. It just was truncated in this experience to be clearly defined. But this conversation of the haves and the have-nots exists in our public school settings. It exists in our family environments, and it exists in the pod conversation as well. Here's the thing is that as an elected official, I've consistently said this, and it's a difficult conversation sometimes to have with my colleagues because all the time is you're requesting for resources, you're asking for more money. And I have to always remind people, if I have a structured household who may have 3 children and only has one head of household, and the mom doesn't speak English and doesn't have her GED and may not even be, has only known New Jersey and is working here and is thriving, but necessarily doesn't have the documentation to say that she's a US citizen, I have to artificially recreate policy and programming so that her children have the same experience that many of you are providing for your students. And fortunately that I can provide for my child as someone who was the first to go to college in her household and who owns a home and who has 2 people in the house who are working and has all those luxuries in a sense, because that's how it gets couched, that we can develop an extended learning program for my daughter if the expectations of what we think the education setting in the public school system is not meeting for her ability.
Senator, I love the point you just made there, in particular around that pods in some ways, or the advantages of them, have existed for so long in so many upper income, middle income even communities. We don't call them as such because they're not your dominant schooling, but what it points to is learning doesn't just happen in school. It's it's your whole environment, right, is where these are occurring. So Jeremiah, I'd love to turn to you next as you think about the pod that you set up and you saw all this media conversation around the pros and cons. Senator Ruiz just talked about many of them that we were hearing on both sides. What was your framing? What's been your framing, like your why of starting the micro school in the first place, and how you couch the pros and cons in this current conversation?
Right. So I think Senator Ruiz is right in a lot here, because a lot of what we've done has only happened because we have a wonderful state. I love my home state of Arizona. We are very school choice and educational opportunity friendly. So we have plenty of programs, but the main program that we use in this state is called the Empowerment Scholarship Account Program. And that basically gives 90% of what a student would receive if they were attending their district school to, I guess, what you call an education savings account. And then that is given to the parent, and the parent is able to use that for whatever. By law, there's only certain things they can use it for, tuition, school materials. It kind of changes every year. It depends on how the legislature is feeling. But the parents are given about 90% of that funding. For our students, it is a lot less than what they would receive in a traditional public school for our students, but it is enough for us to be able to take the learning educational opportunities that we want and be available for our parents. We really started our school not because of the pandemic, because we were operating pre-pandemic. We really started our school because our parents were unhappy with what the local school district was offering in terms of education and value. So our parents were actually just kind of a little bit fed up in many ways, and that is why we kind of came together and we decided to start our own school. So that our reasons for starting were a little bit different, but I like to say that's not because we wanted to, we were against public school. We just really wanted parents who just want different options. And in our community, in a tribal community, we actually only have two options. We don't have any charter schools. Most parents, as Senator Ruiz, you're right, the resources there are very limited. We're in a socially economic disadvantaged community. Many of our families, I learned quickly during COVID that many of our families don't have internet access at home. They only use their cell phones. So we had to quickly buy laptops. We had to quickly buy laptops for students. We had to quickly buy internet hotspots. That wouldn't have happened if we didn't have this type of program in our state to fund our students. So I credit a lot to what our state is doing in terms of educational opportunities. And then the other place, as Senator Ruiz mentioned, was having a space to meet. So we actually meet in a very free space because that is one thing we learned, that a lot of parents, they don't have the resources. They don't have a kitchen table. They're sharing a house in a multi-generational housing. There's not a kitchen table, or there's not a room for them to, learn and, to focus on their schoolwork. There's not someone there to keep them accountable. English is definitely not the first language in our community in some of our households. So we've had to have someone there specifically. That's why we started a school and basically a church, and have someone there that can guide the students throughout the day, throughout the week. So I do believe that resources are needed. I believe that resources are important, and it definitely, there is an equity question here, but I think kind of our solution here in Arizona is also working, and it's been able to help, kind of rectify some of those equity problems here in the state.
Super helpful. And as we turn to me on this question, I'd love your reflections, obviously, on the pros and cons, but you all have a lot of data nationwide also about how the equity gaps and questions have played out in micro schools and pods. So I would love you to give a sense of that, because I remember when I was talking to your CEO, Chris Bennett, relatively recently, he pushed back on some of my assumptions, I would say, around the equity conversation and some of the things that you see. So I'd love you to frame this for us based on the national landscape that you see.
Yeah, certainly. I think in terms of pros, children really need to be around other children. I know this as an early childhood professional. I also know it as a parent, and I also know it as a community member. I can see clearly what happens when children are isolated for long periods of time. So children need to be together. They also need to not be on screens all the time. Learning is not meant to be one-dimensional. or like an isolated activity. Kids learn through doing, even as they get older, and they learn through experience. And so I've seen in my own child actual changes in how her brain works due to being on Zoom all the time. And we used a pod to offset that. There was still a large amount of screen time, but they were able to close the tablets and have the teacher that we brought in do extended learning and be outside more and all of these things. So there are a lot of benefits. In terms of disadvantages, finding space can be really hard. Access is a terrible burden. If you go the route we did, when we found a pod teacher, it was a seller's market, frankly. And so teachers could charge whatever they wanted. And that was really hard for our pod, which had all working parents. But we also didn't feel like we had any other choice, because to not work would mean that someone had to leave a job. And I think that you've probably all seen the statistics on mainly women leaving the workforce. And then on top of that, mainly women of color. And so when you look at that, and then you look at this market of existing childcare programs that Wonder School supports, of licensed operating programs who have been inordinately impacted by the pandemic and loss of enrollment and are struggling to keep their businesses open, they had space and they have space to help children, you know, in small pods, do distance learning, provide that social emotional connection, you know, to each other during this time. And they operate as micro schools already because they're mixed age programs. They're, you know, serving early learning and extended learning. And in our experience nationally, Wonder School tried to connect existing programs that could work with children of school age to children who needed that space. We saw that in a very, very large East Coast school district, was not in New Jersey, we applied or we submitted an RFQ to connect existing family childcare programs with children who need space to do distance learning. And we were declined. We were told, oh, we don't work with in-home programs. And I was like, well, why not? We have literally 100 plus programs ready to take children right now. This would help them keep their businesses open. It would help them bring children together. And they were like, we just don't do that. And we don't see that changing right now. And I was like, well, why don't you think about changing it? And they were like, sorry, no. And then in another district on the West Coast, or actually it was the city supervisor, a childcare provider that we work with reached out to them and was told that pods are illegal, they circumvent the process, they are not supported, they harm children and families. And there was no extension of, well, if you have children that you can care for and you're not licensed as a childcare provider, let us help you through that process. There was nothing like that. And so I think that a con is like the lack of ability to move quickly and be responsive to children and families when they need that responsive thought process, and, you know, bringing together resources that exist and finding resources that don't exist. I could go on all day, but I'll stop.
No, I mean, it's an incredibly important set of issues. I've been incredibly frustrated, like you, that the districts I've talked to have sort of treated this, quite frankly, like the current version of Russian math. We know it's going on, but we wish it weren't. We don't like the parents that have jumped into these pods, and we're not going to facilitate it ourselves to make it more equitable. I found it incredibly frustrating, but I think it's a good pivot to, if we think about this from a positive perspective, what should federal, state, district policy and regulation and funding look like around this question of pods? Quite frankly, not just in the COVID moment, but I'd invite you also to think beyond that about what that would look like. Senator Ruiz, why don't we turn to you first on this question?
So I just do want to say that districts during this time frame, because I'm not so sure, at least in my area, it was for a lack of will or perceiving pods to be, because the way at least the way I was thinking about it was even the local library down the block, right? We were just trying to emulate what people were doing in their basement or in their backyard in a public setting with maybe a college student who wasn't even enrolled anymore and was in the teacher trajectory pipeline. Give them some experience. How can we get that person certified in a way? Like really just trying to think aggressively how to build these scenarios. And I don't think it was for a lack of wanting on behalf of at least the districts that I spoke to. I mean, it came down to budget. We flat funded 2 budgets in a row during this pandemic timeframe, and we know that flat funding budgets is a deficit because cost of living continues to go up, and contractual agreements have their expectations of meeting whatever percentages go up. I really do think that the funding should come from the state, but of course, in a time where again the pandemic overhauls and the budgets get compressed and revenue lines get smaller and smaller, the federal government has to think about ways, right? And in the CARES funding that we saw, I wish there would have been, while there was direct funding to school districts based on Title I, we know that the bulk of that money went to outfitting school buildings, the spaces, PPE, getting computers. You know, I had instituted a bill to get laptops to students last March. It was unfortunately vetoed. Then the state launched a program in July. We didn't get our number down in the state to 1,500 to 1,700 families as of last week, which means there was this huge gap during this entire frame that I had children that didn't have computer and didn't have internet. So I'm not quite sure what exactly they were doing during that time frame. So I think the pod conversation goes outside of this. Unfortunately, I hope that this never happens again, but we have to be prepared. This is teaching us that we need to be prepared for when the lights go out, how do we turn them back on, right? And so there should be this blueprint or this additional infrastructure that provides for families in an equitable way. So we're not making decisions of who's going to give up their job, who's going to stay home, you know, who's going to work on a part-time basis, if you can even do that, or who's going to say, I can't do this. So it's my first grader who's going to be the one who's going to eat the bulk of this because they're not going to attend school at all. And that's happening in households in the state and probably happening across the country. So if there's a family that has to make a decision, I have to pay the bills, I have to pay rent, I have to put food on the table, which means no one can stay home, and there's a caretaker maybe with a child or an older sibling, and there's no computer and there's no internet, we've lost that child for a year. And so this is what I'm saying is, pods in this time frame are defined a different way, but I want to pivot the conversation to say, how do we use the pod or the virtual learning space to do summer intensive programs in combination with in-person learning? How do we launch this kind of virtual pod space within the public school system? So maybe we have Saturday academies, because to me, if my daughter's teacher says on Saturday we're going to do intense math learning, whatever it is, that becomes a pod in my mind, right? So thinking outside of the space of what pods have been defined in this time frame and really talking about it in a way that we can launch an opportunity to adhere to what I feel is the greatest civil justice, right justice discourse that we should have now. We are losing children in this country every single day because of because of the inequities that exist in our public school systems.
No, really powerful. Thank you for saying it. We're running out of time, so I would love, Jeremiah, Mia, like 30-second reflections, each of you. Jeremiah first. What should the policy landscape look like?
Right. So I actually think we do have policies in place already. You could look to states like us here in Arizona who have programs like the Empowerment Scholarship Account, which give the funding directly to the parents, and the parents are able then to choose if they want to put their kid in a private school, they can. If they want to pay for an instructor to come to their home, they can. If they want to put them in a micro school, this is a great program. I believe our legislature is actually taking more steps to expand this program to other students this year. So students in Title I schools will now be eligible for this program. That's hoping that the legislature goes through with this year. But I think this type of program is something that is more impactful than anything we've ever seen in the education landscape here, especially in this state. It is something parents throughout the pandemic, it has our numbers for kids in this program have just swelled. So I believe this is a good policy solution. I hope other states follow our policy solutions as what we're doing here in Arizona. But this is something that I believe that parents are getting on board with and they are supporting. And it's something we can do now, and it's showing that it's working. It's worked in our community. So I'm hoping we can bring that model to other communities as well.
Perfect. Mia, 15 seconds, I think, given time, but yeah, your
I
thoughts.
think that as a country, we should follow the lead of Jeremiah, Arizona, Senator Ruiz in New Jersey, and look outside of how we've done things traditionally, re-examine our funding priorities, and look at, maybe take it all apart and put it back together in a different way, because the pandemic hasn't stopped. So the need for, learning pods for large numbers of children hasn't stopped and will continue to exist into the future. And we want to make sure that we're best supporting all learners across all learning environments to the very best of our ability. It's too important not to.
Well said, Mia Pritz, Jeremiah Cota, Senator Teresa Ruiz. Thank you so much for joining us in this important conversation. Really appreciate you all tuning in as well.